Hello everyone, my name is Krzysztof WOLSKI and I'm going to present the project titled Geo-metric, a perceptual dataset of distortions on faces, which is a result of my last year's internship at Applied Perception Science team at Meta. As the title suggests, I will be talking about types of distortions that might appear on 3D meshes representing human faces as a result of different mesh processing algorithms. We will also investigate how to evaluate the impact of such distortions on perceived mesh quality. But before going into the details of this work, let's talk about the quality of visual signal. In the domain of digital imaging, the way how data is stored, presented or generated may introduce multiple undesired distortions. For storage, lossy compression algorithms reduce the file size of raster graphics, but may sacrifice quality as can be seen on the left-hand side. We can also point some problems in computer graphics. For example, we can experience aliasing occurring as jagged edges of the objects. And of course, this is just a small subset of things that can go wrong. It is very useful to practitioners to be able to automatically assess the perceived impact of these distortions on quality. This can help design better algorithms or set appropriate trade-offs between quality loss and efficiency. For images, image difference metrics are commonly employed for this purpose. They are very useful to reduce the workload of evaluating the perceptual impact by replacing a costly subjective study with an automated assessment. MSE, SSIM, and multiple variants of metric VDP are some of the well-known representatives. While MSE measures simple distances between pixels, the latter ones try to model the human visual system with the goal of generating scores similar to those given by human subjects. In computer graphics, though, it could be helpful to analyze artifacts coming from earlier points in the rendering pipeline. I mean here the distortions introduced to the meshes representing 3D objects. How do we evaluate quality of the meshes themselves? We can use one of the existing mesh quality metrics. Again, we can find metrics that operate on simple Euclidean distances like metro or RMS, and also ones that model human visual system like MSDM, DAME, FMPD, and others. However, there are a few problems with them. First of all, in contrary to image quality metrics, these metrics were often evaluated on relatively small datasets composed of just a few base meshes. For example, Leary's EPFL general purpose dataset is composed of only 88 distorted meshes, generated from 4 reference meshes. Leary's localized geometric artifacts database and masking database are even smaller. In contrast, our dataset is composed of 2400 distorted meshes that originate from 100 references. Secondly, all mentioned metrics provide arbitrary scores that do not have a direct correspondence to human perception, making them difficult to interpret. For example, how do we know how much distorted is the mesh for which metric MSDM returned value of 0.67? We do not really know it, and the same value returned by DAME might have completely different meaning, which makes the interpretation of these scores even more difficult. Next, none of the mesh-based metrics support variable viewing distance, which is an important factor in human perception. As shown in the bottom of the slide, a higher frequency distortion might be not visible when seen from afar. And last but not least, none of the datasets used for evaluation of the metrics consisted of high-quality meshes representing human faces. This is especially important as human characters or avatars are ubiquitous in gaming, entertainment, and social applications. To solve these problems, we decided to design our new dataset. We started the whole process with a large collection of human head scans consisting of more than 1400 samples from different demographic groups. The scanning has been conducted with the use of professional toolset manufactured by 3DMD. To protect the privacy of the scanned subjects, we decided to generate a synthetic dataset which preserves features of the original population. For this purpose, we incorporated principal component analysis. In order to use PCA, we needed to standardize the meshes first. To do so, we registered all the head scans to the template mesh using a commercially available software called R3DS-RAP. The template mesh was generated by an artist and was originally designed for facial expression details. After registration, we processed all the meshes creating the PCA model and the average head mesh. When creating the PCA, we saved 196 principal components, which explains 99% of the variance in the input dataset. Next, instead of random sampling from the distribution of the space of the PCE model, we came up with a solution allowing us to better control the features of the output meshes. In this method, we blend the carefully selected heads. We begin the process by inversely solving the coefficients of the three input heads belonging to the same demographic group. Then we generate a new set of coefficients by blending them, and finally these blended coefficients are used to generate a new blended mesh. This way, we generated 100 high-quality synthetic meshes that preserve the features of their input demographic group. We split them equally between males and females, and additionally, we carefully mimic the demographics distribution provided in the US Census, making it more versatile. When we had our base dataset, it was time for distortions. We decided on three main types that can arise in common geometry applications. Let's start with noise. Literature describes distortions coming from compression and watermarking as noise-like distortions. When we look on the meshes coming from the reconstruction process, we can also notice some surface imperfection which can be attributed to noise. Hence, we decided to cover spectrum of these distortions with paralleling noise using 4 different frequencies, where mid frequencies can be compared to reconstruction artifacts, high frequencies can mimic the quantization error of naive compression, and low frequencies can represent the compression in spectral domain. Simplification seems to be quite obvious choice as it is a core of popular level of detail algorithm. Information on distortion caused by simplification is also very beneficial when dense meshes are decimated for 3D printing. Lastly, following previous studies, we decided to include Laplacian smoothing. Distortions created with it have similar nature to the ones caused by the VDB-based remeshing. For each type of distortion, we generated 4 carefully selected levels of magnitude. Here we can see an example of magnitudes of the lowest frequency noise. Please note that these distortions were enhanced for presentation purposes. To learn more on how we set these magnitudes, let's take a look at the experimental procedure used in our study. We have run the 2 alternative force choice experiment during which we presented the observer with 2 distorted meshes, belonging to the same type of distortion. The task was to select the mesh that is less distorted. To avoid obvious comparisons, or impossible ones, which do not add information to the set, only distortion magnitudes of up to 2 steps away from each other were compared. Yet still it was very important that these magnitudes were set correctly. So how did we do it? For brevity, I will present how magnitudes were found only for the noise distortion, but the procedure is similar for the other distortion types. First, we generated 101 fine-grained magnitudes of distortion starting from non-distorted mesh to clearly distorted one, which was chosen empirically. Next, we ran staircase procedure, which allowed us to find a threshold at which person starts seeing the distortion. The history of choices during the study can be seen on the right-hand side. The outcome of such experiment can be seen on the left side of the slide in a form of a psychometric function with a threshold marked as the dashed line. We have used this threshold as our first magnitude. The last magnitude was designated by the frequency at which psychometric function was saturating. The 2 intermediate magnitudes were selected as 2 equidistant points between the first and the last magnitude. Such careful selection allowed us to collect meaningful data in the main study. Coming back to the stimuli presentation, we decided to show the reference mesh along the distorted ones. It was done to provide an anchor for the decision given on different magnitude levels and to prevent the influence of preference mechanism. When it comes to the rendering of the meshes, we decided to display them non-textured and render with a single uniform neutral gray color. This is expected to maximize sensitivity to distortions as overlapping signals from texture can cause masking. To illuminate them, we used a distant top right light source mimicking natural environmental conditions. Because this can leave the lower portion of the head unlit, we added a lower intensity light from the bottom left direction, avoiding unnaturally strong shadows. In our study, we decided also to test 2 perceptual effects and their combinations. To understand how perception of each artifact changes with distance, we show the heads in close and far settings. We also know that humans are very sensitive to distortions on human faces, but we wanted to know how much. We were inspired by famous Thatcher illusion to test heads flipped upside down. Such modification can possibly reduce the effect of the face recognition pathways in our visual system. We asked 100 paid participants to take part in our study. Each person performed 3 full hour-long sessions with 280 trials each. In total, we gathered 84,000 subjective measurements. Let's see the outcome of this study. To interpret collected data, we first need to process it and convert to just objectionable difference unit. Such format of data is very intuitive, as it can be easily interpreted as the percentage of population that can notice the distortion. After the conversion, we could finally plot the collected data. In this slide, you can see the results for the distortion caused by the lowest frequency noise. The 4 different viewing conditions I mentioned before are depicted with 4 different colored lines, where the blue one represents big flipped heads, red one big normally oriented heads, yellow the small flipped ones, and purple small normally oriented heads. The x-axis in the plot represents amplitude of noise, and y-axis represents the GOD scale. The lower the GOD value, the worse the quality of the mesh. We can observe that for the low frequency noise, visibility of distortion seems to be approximately the same for the close objects and the far ones. One of the explanations for that could be that when the low frequency noise is visible from further distance, it appears as a higher frequency noise which might land in the range of frequencies that human visual system is sensitive to. The results for low frequency noise support our claim, as we can observe the separation between the close and far shapes. Observers were much more sensitive to the distortion when the object was placed closer to the camera. This can be explained in a similar manner as before. When the objects are moved far away, the perceived frequency of noise increases, but this time the frequency might land in the range to which human visual system is less sensitive. This effect is even more pronounced for the high and the highest frequency noises. We can observe that with increase of the noise frequency, the distortion becomes less and less visible for the far heads denoted by the purple and yellow lines. However, flipping the heads has no effect on the perceived quality, which has been further confirmed with statistical testing. In the case of simplification, the plot on the left-hand side, we can clearly notice that distortions of close heads were spotted much easier than for the far heads. This agrees with our intuition and also proves the foundation of the LOD technique. In terms of smoothing, we can see slight separation between the close and far heads. The very subtle downward trend, though, shows that this particular distortion was very difficult for observers, and most of them were guessing blindly as they could not spot the difference. This designates that human visual system is not sensitive to this particular distortion, given meshes representing faces. Again, for both distortions, it can be observed that flipping of the heads has no effect on the perceived quality. We use this finding in further exploration and merge the results for the heads of different orientation. Having GOD values for all the heads from the dataset, we decided to check how well metric predictions correlate with subjective data we collected. At first, we checked the correlation for a single distance for every single distortion type separately. As can be seen, FMPD seems to be the most versatile metric amongst all the other tested. Surprisingly, RMS also provides a good correlation when only a single type of distortion is considered at a time. When we check correlation for both distances at the same time, the correlation becomes much worse, especially for the distortion types that are dependent to the viewing distance, that is, higher frequency noises and simplification. This shows how important it is to provide metrics with an ability to work with different viewing distances. That's why we decided to retarget the state-of-the-art metrics. But this is only one of the reasons. The retargeted metric should not only be able to account for the viewing distance, but also have a clear, easy-to-read output. To provide the output in GOD unit, which can be easily translated to probability of noticing the distortion, we try to find an empirical remapping of the metric outputs using collected data. After experimenting with different functional forms, we found that the exponential function provided the best fit. In this equation, x denotes the raw metric output, while y is the output of the metric expressed in the GOD unit. A and B are the 3 parameters that have to be found for every single metric separately. To incorporate distance as a factor, we modulated the results of the retargeted metric using the ratio of visual angles subtended by the object. We used the size of the stimuli shown in the closed condition of our study to set the reference angle alpha and the current size of the object to set angle beta. Using this data, we modified the retargeting formula as shown at the bottom of the slide. This equation can be further reformulated so one can use distance relative to the observer instead of the angles. In such form, ME denotes the maximum extent of the object, which is equal to half of the maximum size of the bounding box, while D1 and D2 are distances corresponding to visual angles alpha and beta respectively. To verify whether our perceptual scaling works as expected, we tested the retargeted version of metric FMPD in the perceptually bound compression application. First, we generated a sequence of compressed meshes using the Draco library. While compressing the meshes, we were modifying the number of bits required to quantize the coordinates of the mesh vertices. Next, we ran the retargeted FMPD on these meshes, comparing them to the reference mesh to find their quality values expressed in JOD units. To decide whether distortion is visible or not, we set our visibility threshold to 1 GOD, which means that 75% of population would be able to spot distortion in the distorted mesh when compared against the reference. According to this threshold, the mesh whose vertices are quantized on 13 bits is still perceptually lossless. To confirm how well the metric can predict the visibility threshold, we have run the subjective study similar to the one we used to collect subjective data for our dataset. The outcome of this experiment shows similar trends, yet according to our observers, mesh quantized on 13 bits still contains some visible distortions. We have repeated the same procedure for some other meshes. For this one, the metric predicts that mesh can be quantized on 12 bits, which agrees with the subjective data we collected. If we look closer, the mesh quantized on 11 bits have some visible noise-like distortion on the cheeks, while these distortions are not visible on the surface of the mesh quantized on 12 bits. We tested this metric also on meshes that do not represent faces. As can be seen for this mechanical part, prediction of retargeted metric agrees with the subjective data on perceptual lossless compression level. To verify our formula that incorporates distance to the metric, we came up with an idea of the automatic LOD application. The idea was to find the correct distance at which the consecutive LOD meshes need to be swapped to prevent any visible distortions. We took a mesh shown on the left side of the slide and generated a few LOD meshes by reducing number of vertices by half at every iteration. Next, we used our metric to find the shortest distances for which the swap between the LOD meshes becomes invisible. We tested 3 different thresholds, 0.4, 0.7 and 1 GOD depicted in the plot as red, yellow and purple lines. Next, we asked an artist to set the swapping distances manually as one would do during the process of asset authorization. Artist choices are depicted as the blue line in the plot. As can be seen, the manual adjustment lands very close to the automatic ones produced for detection thresholds 1 and 0.7 GOD. This change of a threshold value can be motivated by the fact that swapping of the meshes produces temporal artifacts to which human visual system is very sensitive, so we should also increase sensitivity of the metric. Finally, here you can see how meshes are switching in real time. On the left hand side, the distances were set manually by the artist, while on the right hand side, distances were set automatically by retargeted FMPD. Summarizing, we created a large-scale perceptual database of the visibility of geometric distortions on faces. We provided a way to calibrate existing metrics so they output meaningful, easy-to-comprehend values. We proposed a simple solution on how mesh-based metrics can support variable viewing distance, and we demonstrated how calibrated metrics can be used in applications like automatic LOD or perceptually driven mesh compression. Thank you very much for your attention, and for more details, please visit our project webpage.